Welcome to Speak Your Mind by Climobilize, where we're putting the spotlight on voices that are being crowded out by the mainstream. My guest for this session is Matt Orsagh. Matt is the Chief Content Officer at ED4S, which stands for Education for Sustainability, and he is the co-founder of Rise Sustainable Investment Consulting. You may have come across Matt's work at the CFA Institute, an organization that certifies financial professionals, where he was known for his research and writing on sustainable finance issues. And for anyone interested in degrowth, I urge you to have a look at Matt's Substack page, which can be easily found via Google. Hi, Matt. It's great to have you with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Brad.
My pleasure. In this session, Matt is going to be exploring why has declaring climate emergencies failed to create meaningful change. So let's start with, Matt, what is a climate emergency declaration?
Sure. Yeah, this may be something, a new terminology to a lot of people, but what a climate emergency declaration or CED is exactly what it sounds. It's a government or municipality, a state or province, what have you, declaring a climate emergency. And that gives the government certain powers. You think of it can be equivalent to like wartime powers or something. In an emergency, a government has certain powers that they don't normally. The issue is that not a lot has happened with these CEDs, climate emergency declarations. There's been 18 countries plus the EU itself that have had climate emergency declarations. All told, including cities, municipalities, states, provinces, all around the world, there's been over 2,000 of these climate emergency declarations over the past decade. About 1 billion people currently live under some kind of climate emergency declaration around the world, but not a lot has changed. And part of the problem is that we'll get into is, these are words on paper, but actions really haven't followed them thus far.
Okay. So what are some of the countries outside the EU that have declared climate emergencies, or some of the cities?
Yeah, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, cities, Toronto, where you are, has New York has a couple other large cities that you have known have done these. One of the most interesting stories is Canada. I think it was 2019 declared a climate emergency declaration, and then the next day they signed into law a expansion of a pipeline to take oil from Alberta to British Columbia. Now, they say that the proceeds from that pipeline are to fund, the climate transition. But if you look at the math, the proceeds from that pipeline are dwarfed by, I think, 7 or 8 times by the amount of subsidies that Canada still has in oil and gas. So a climate emergency declaration, and in many ways, is good PR, it's good marketing, but it's not necessarily, it's talking the talk, it's not necessarily walking the walk.
Right. Well, our government has a different way of doing math. So apparently it works up here. But so where does it all break down? So we have this here in Toronto, we have this great climate declaration or emergency declaration, and we have these great documents, but nothing of consequence gets done. So I suspect that's not much different from the entire global approach to this. So where is it breaking down?
This stuff is hard. Acting on climate change is a big thing, and it's hard, and it will be expensive. It will change people's lives, and politicians don't like doing those kind of things normally. A politician's job is to get elected in the next cycle. Most leaders, their jobs are to keep their jobs. And telling people that things are going to change in a drastic way, probably things will become more expensive to pay for these changes. And they may have to make changes to the way they live and the way they do things, is going to be unpopular. Now, the good thing is that you see more and more people understanding that climate change is a problem, and not just climate change, but the loss. We can talk about planetary boundaries as well that have been breached. But climate change is the most obvious one. Um, that you can see people becoming more aware of what's going on, but we still haven't reached the tipping point where people understand how much of an issue this is, and how it's going to come to their front door. The analogy people use is World War II. It was a huge thing that people didn't want to get involved in because it was something over there that was happening. We're talking from a North American perspective, but eventually it became obvious. Pearl Harbor was the event in American history that dragged the U.S. into the war. Uh, it became obvious that they couldn't ignore it any longer, and so we will reach that point at some point. I hope it's sooner rather than later, because that's when the action needs to start sooner rather than later. And some action has been taken, of course, but it's mostly small things like I mentioned the Canadian pipeline proceeds, but those are still dwarfed by oil and gas subsidies, and that's the case in most places. Even the European Union, that's the most advanced in regulation around climate and natural capital issues, still needs to go farther to get us where we need to go.
So if it's not working, politicians don't feel compelled or safe to take meaningful action. Um, I'm just going to go on a slight tangent. In 2009, we had a liberal politician here in Canada who campaigned on reducing our carbon emissions,
Yeah,
and he was soundly defeated.
yeah.
Now it's a lot of time has passed since 2009, and it's very possible that he could have much more of a resonating message with the public. But if it's not working, should we just forget about climate emergencies, or are the tools of climate emergencies exactly what we need, and we just need to get to a place where we can get leadership that has those tools um, to make the necessary changes?
I think that's a great point. Leaders need permission to lead. Is a good way to think of it. Whether that's at a small company you're part of, or a large corporation you're part of, or you're a citizen in a country with a government, um, they need permission to lead. They need permission to make the decisions they make. Uh, a good example is I looked at the data around the election in 2022 in the U.S. It was just the congressional elections, and then the presidential election is going to be happening later in 2024. But in 2022, I looked to see where was climate change in people's minds is the most important issue, because people usually vote on the most one, two, three important issues in their lives, right? And climate change was about seventh or eighth in most people's minds of where it was in the U.S. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, as we're taping this. And that's up a great deal from where it was back in 2009, where you mentioned, and even 5 years ago. But it's not one or two or three where it drives what people want. It drives people's decisions. And until it gets there, uh, we're going to have a lot of the same, talking the talk but not walking the walk problem. Now, it's encouraging that you can look at studies about when does collective action happen in societies. And people can look at this research, but it's usually around 25%, when about 25% of the population, whether it's at a company or in a country, of the population can be vast or it could be small, but when about 25% of the population gets fired up about something, really believes in something, it's their number one concern, and it drives their decision making, then it cascades into more and more of society. And if you look at the numbers, we're close to that number in a lot of places in climate change, but it just needs to get there faster. We need citizens and people to talk about these issues more, because if you're hearing more of your friends talk about climate change, your family talk about climate change, it happens in your school, then it becomes harder to ignore. There's a reason that advertising works. There's a reason that what Coca-Cola is, but you still see billboards for it. You may think it's annoying, but it's because of people want mind share. of what you're thinking about. And climate change is no different. Any environmental issue is no different. It's if it's at the top of people's minds, if it's at their front door, they want something done about it. If it's something's like, yeah, I've heard about that, but I'm not too worried about that. So something's going to happen in 20 years. Then they're not going to ask for action and give permission to their leaders to act on it.
So one of the other questions that we're exploring in this effort of Speak Your Mind is if you get the right leader who declares the emergency and starts to make the appropriate steps, how do you rein in that politician from overreach, which is a huge problem and fear we have these days with
Yep.
authoritarian leaders? It's great if they're doing what you want them to do, but don't be fooled by a politician, speaking to your goals one day, because that will change. So it's we need these policy changes, but we also and the Declaration of Climate Emergencies allows for that. But we also have to keep a tight rein on politicians. Um, do you have any thoughts on that challenge that we face?
Yeah, that's why I'm not too worried about whether a climate emergency is declared or not. That's kind of superfluous to me. It gets back to, does the society want this? Does the society give permission to their politicians to do this? And it gets to that, that 25% number, or where it's number one, two, or three on people's, it's what they're voting on. And at that point, it's usually not going to be the case where a politician has to drag people over the line in some kind of authoritarian manner and saying, well, we're suspending, these rights to have, to take action on climate emergency. It's when the population believes in enough that they show the politicians, they show their leadership that this is what they want. It's easier to get them on board to make those changes. But those conversations need to be had, at the political level, and they need to be honest as they can be, to tell people this is the situation, this is where we are, this is what we need to do, and this is my plan or our plan to try to do it, and to involve people in those dialogues as much as possible. And I think that way you're not relying on a one man or one woman to just declare that this is what we're doing, because that, if you don't have people buying into it and you don't have support from up below from the population, it's not going to work, I don't think.
Right. And I'm not a psychologist, and I don't play one on videos, but I think that there's a tipping point of the in-group suddenly becoming the group that talks about climate change, as opposed to
Yeah.
being the out-group that doesn't talk about climate change. And that is a sociological shift in societal thinking, and that's what we need to bring about. And then we can put this climate declaration. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we can put this climate declaration approach to rest, because people, or it's just more of a formality because people will be
Right.
thinking that that's where we need to go. Um, and we've seen that happen in some countries back in the 30s, last century. And when you feel that you can't speak about something, or you should be speaking about something, we have this way of censoring what we're saying. And we need people, maybe you could talk to that. The people who are denying this challenge, how do we get them to self-censor? I know that's not really a question that you have an answer to, but maybe you could just reflect on that for a moment.
Well, clarify a little the exact question you're asking. I have to make sure I got it right.
So I think we need to get to a point where the people who are speaking about climate change are in the in group, and that's the conversation that is accepted by everyone, and whereas the people who are denying it, they feel like they're outsiders, and they might feel a little anxious or nervous about speaking up against this reality that we need to do something about this, and we need those voices to go away, um, or at least be less prominent than they are today.
Well, this gets into a really interesting whole different topic of kind of bubbles media bubbles and information bubbles that we can get into if we wish. Think back, I think back, 40, 50 years ago in the US, for example, there were 3 news networks, and you could get your news for a half-hour block from 3 sources that were very, very similar. And there wasn't a lot of room I saw a writer write this recently, of bespoke realities. I thought that's a very clever term.
Yeah.
But you can very much can have that now if you want. You can have a very narrow point of view from the left and the right and any kind of issue, and you can find a community that supports you and lets you believe that for a very long time. That's not going away. That's not going to change. But the broader culture drives what gets done and what people talk about and what is important. And so, whether on the topic of climate, that's a cultural change. Think back 10 years ago, it was very impolite to talk about climate, and people didn't want to. And that's not really the case anymore. People are comfortable talking about it. I know people, in my personal life, professional life, have much more frank conversations around climate change than they did 5 years ago. It's not where I think it should be and where it needs to be. But as that culture changes, those bespoke realities get ignored more because they're just not worth people's time. And as people get exposed to more of the reality of climate and what we need to do, especially younger folks, as they get into positions of power and start running things, we'll look back on this time as ridiculous. Why we didn't take action sooner.
Yeah, it's interesting because every one of these conversations comes back to behavioral change and societal change.
Yeah.
It's not about the science. We know the science. It's not about technology. We have the technology. Um, so as we come to the end, is there any sort of words or thoughts that you want to leave the audience with, to think about, to consider when it comes to the challenge we have and how to mobilize to address it, because the path we're on is pretty dangerous.
Yeah, I think that it's right there in the word you said, mobilize. And that can be anything from, very activist uh, actions to reaching out and talking to more people about these issues about climate change. It's a cultural change of how we address these things. And it's moving in the right direction. But having these conversations with your family and friends and colleagues, asking questions of your politicians and your leaders about why they're not addressing these things, and you want them to address these things. You can't stay silent on climate change. That doesn't mean you have to go march in the streets and burn things down. Please don't do that. Well, you can march in the streets. Please don't burn things down. But it's an existential threat, and we have to treat it as such. And that means we have to talk about it, and we have to address it, and we have to take action.
Yeah, and I think that that's the main message by climate scientist, Canadian, Catherine Hayhoe, whose book is title escapes me at this moment. Um, but I will guess it has to do with surviving climate change, and it's all about conversations. Matt, thank you so much for sharing your ideas and thoughts with us today. Um, it's great to have people from so many different backgrounds and economic specialties focus on this one issue where we all need to come together. And I look forward to facing these challenges with you as we embark on a new year and at the time when anything's possible. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Brad. Take care.